Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are joining, participants joining this conference from different parts of the world. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. My name is Maia Chankseliani. I am Associate Professor of Comparative International Education at the University of Oxford, and I also co-lead Project 9 at CGHE, which looks at supranational higher education. This session today of the CG's annual conference brings together two important talks on employability and on governance. This session is divided into two parts. In the first 30 minutes, we will engage with Golo Henseke's presentation on what skills do employers associate with degree qualifications. Golo's talk will be followed by the Q&A. In the second half of the session, we will listen to Michael Shattuck and Nico Horwath, who will talk about universities and regions, confronting the leveling up agenda. Again, the second talk will be followed up by its own Q&A. So we will have two separate talks and two separate Q&As. As we listen to the speakers, I would like to encourage all participants to share your comments and your questions in the chat function. I will invite you to ask your questions and share your comments in due course. Now let me first introduce our first speaker, Dr. Golo Henseke, who is based at the UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. Golo Henseke is a research associate on CG's Project 4, which is titled Graduate Labour Market and Equity. The floor is yours, Golo.
Thanks so much, Maia, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen as practiced. There we go. I'm going to present work in progress from an ongoing CGHE project to understand the often varied graduate labor market outcomes through a demand side perspective. And in so doing, it ties in with some of the discussion we had just before lunch in the employability panel. The project overall aims to understand better how employers deploy and draw on graduate skills. My presentation today discusses this research as it shifts towards a demand side analysis by looking at jobs, their content, their qualification requirements, and especially what happened to both over time and what are the consequences for pay. So you see, it's very much work in progress because the title has even changed. That's how much progress there's going on. So the research questions, more specifically. First of all, the overarching question is, what are the major trends in the graduate labor market, and how well, if at all, can those trends be understood through a demand side analysis? The more specific questions are then, how much have qualification requirements changed during the mass expansion of higher education? What job tasks predict degree requirements? So how does what people do on the job relate to those qualification requirements? And how much of the change in degree requirements is then actually task warranted? And finally, I want to explore the importance of task-warranted degree requirements for graduate wages. I'll talk about this in a bit. So in general, there's a large literature on graduate labor market outcomes. There's so many different strands, it's really hard to actually synthesize them. I've looked at mainly two here. There's the vast literature on the graduate wage premium that is mostly focused on the supply side and program characteristics, and finds a lot of stuff that correlates with graduate wages after leaving university. However, this literature ignores often the role of job destination as a potential mediator for these differences in graduate wages. On the other hand, we have a large over-education literature, which pretty much looks at job destination and finds an almost universal pay penalty for graduates in non-graduate jobs, but with mixed evidence on trends. Usually this literature splits graduates into a group of matched and mismatched graduates, those in graduate jobs versus those in non-graduate jobs. But this dichotomization happens usually with very little regard for actual job contents. What I want to do is to look actually at these jobs, and in so doing, take this perspective by Van der Velde and Wiesmann, for example, propose that skills won't become productive unless used on the job. In the following, I'm going to draw on the task approach, as it's in very well-established economic framework of thinking about labor market trends. Jobs are generally conceived in this framework as bundles of tasks. A task is defined as a unit of work activity that produces output. It is distinct from a skill, which is a worker's endowment of capability for performing various tasks. And this distinction between tasks and skills allows a richer analysis of the link between what jobs demand and what capacities an individual brings. There's, as a consequence, no one-to-one mapping of skills to tasks. Skills in this context determine how many tasks a worker can carry out per unit of time, either kind of productivity. And I understand this is very economically thinking. Digitalization in this context is contributing to the replacement of labor and tasks that can be made sufficiently routine for automation. But by contrast, digitalization complements high-skilled, usually university-educated workers in carrying out problem-solving and complex communication activities. So in this framework, graduates are have been the winners of recent technological change. It makes the following predictions that I find helpful to assess what actually happened to graduate labor markets or on graduate labor markets, in graduate labor markets. That's the preposition I was looking for. First of all, the first prediction would be that job task profiles shifted towards cognitive and interpersonal tasks, thus driving up skills and qualification requirements. Secondly, as digitalization complements graduate skills, graduates have become more productive in a wider range of tasks, including in previously non-graduate jobs. Thirdly, the demand and thus pay for university-educated workers rose in relative and absolute terms. And finally, in the absence of technological change, range of tasks carried out by graduates would have grown, but with downward pressure on graduates' pay and the pay of others. So the idea is that you need some kind of change in how work is carried out in order for graduates graduates' pay to keep growing as the supply expands. So with that in mind, let's have a look at what happened on the British in the British labor market. Figure 1 summarizes the surge in the percentage of workers educated to degree level. So by 2020, graduates constituted about 35% of the employed workforce aged 20 to 60 years, up from just 13% 25 years earlier. So it's a massive expansion. The increase has been steady with no signs of slowdown so far. This increase in attainment was closely matched by an increase in average graduate wages until about 2007, after which attainment and wages seemingly decoupled. That's what you can see in the second chart. Graduate and non-graduate wages followed very similar patterns throughout the period, apparently tracking macroeconomic developments rather than the expansion of higher educational attainment in the workforce. For both groups, median real wages peaked before the Great Recession in 2007-2008, fell sharply thereafter, and recovered only modestly since 2005. In 2021, average real graduate wages were about as high as they were 2 decades earlier. Given the parallel trends in graduate and non-graduate pay, the higher education wage premium remained roughly stable throughout the period, as chart 3, consistent with findings in previous studies. The rapid transformation from an elite system to to a mass higher education system has coincided with rising inequality within graduates up to a point, and that's what you can see in chart 4. However, as for average pay, the trend towards greater inequality among graduates has arrested and reversed after 2015, thus seemingly decoupling from the ongoing expansion of higher education. Pay inequality within non-graduates fell throughout the period with an acceleration after 2015. So what to make of this? The previous slides paint a contradictory picture of the state of the graduate labor market. The stable pay premium is often given as evidence for a labor market in relative good health that absorbed the rising supply of graduates. However, the sharp drop in graduate and non-graduate wages after the Great Recession challenges this interpretation. Furthermore, the observed increase in graduate pay inequality could be indicative of rising skills heterogeneity within graduates in the wake of massification, but while the expansion of university attainment has continued unabated, pay inequality among graduates has started to slip, which casts doubt on a purely ability-based explanation for the rise in the first place. So with this as a backdrop, few studies have turned to the demand side to examine these trends. Employers might seek to recruit graduates for various reasons, including the skills degree certify, the ability they signal, or the symbolic fit they demarcate. This plot charts the evolution of degree requirements on job entry as reported by workers using unique data from the Skills and Employment Survey series. The survey asked workers if they were applying today, what qualification would anyone or would someone need to get the type of job that you have now? The chart in this slide plots the evolution of jobs that, according to workers, would require degree qualification on entry. And noticeably, the share rose from about 15% in 1997 to just shy of 30% 20 years later. Two things may stand out here. The overall pattern matches roughly the changing qualification mix in the labor force, as we've seen earlier. However, the pace was uneven. There was a noticeable pickup between 2006 and 2012, which coincides with the Great Recession and its aftermath and the slip in graduate real wages. So we were interested to better understand what's behind this increase in qualification requirements. We thus correlated degree requirements as reported by workers with the job content they reported as well in the Skill and Employment Survey series. So we can study with using this data how well qualification requirements are grounded in job content. Our analysis confirms that there's a rather close relationship of the importance of specific tasks and degree requirements. More specifically, we find that the tasks that I list here are positive predictors of degree requirements, which are basically a mix of non-routine cognitive and interpersonal tasks, as well as some specialist knowledge requirements, which meets expectation. Having established this relationship of tasks with degree requirements, we can next assess how well the observed rise in degree requirement compares to the change in degree requirements predicted from changes in task content. As you can see in this chart, up to 2006, changes in the left and right hand side or left and right picture more or less overlap. This suggests that there was task warranted expansion of degree requirements from 1997 to 2006. However, after 2006, something happened. Rising degree requirements decoupled from changes in job content. You can see this by the flattening of the line. What to make of this? Why would employers increase qualification requirements for otherwise unchanged jobs? From an economic point of view, they might do that to recruit workers that they believe are more productive independently of the task performed. We thus turn next to wages to better understand how graduate and non-graduate wages respond to paper and skill requirements. And that's what I can show you in this slide. And this findings are very preliminary, I should caveat. So what can we see here? We have looked at how paper requirements and skill requirements correlate with non-graduate and graduate wages. The blue lines are non-graduates and the red lines are the graduates. First, the results suggest what matters for pay is the task people carry out rather than the paper needed to get the job. As you can see here, because this effect is larger than this effect. And this applies for non-graduates as well as the graduates. This is consistent, or maybe this is generally consistent with the idea that it's what matters are skills rather than the paper requirements for pay and productivity. Furthermore, as expected, tasks associated with degree requirements attract a larger papering among graduates than non-graduates, which is consistent with graduates actually being productive in carrying out graduate tasks. Second, somewhat against expectation, we find no evidence that task unwarranted degree requirements, i.e. paper requirements, attract a wage premium, which is not consistent with the ideas that employers raise recruitment standards for productivity consideration. And as I said, these findings are work in progress and might change. Nonetheless, I think my hope is not too much. So this brings me to my conclusions. There's been an ongoing expansion of university attainment, stable pay premium due to parallel trends in graduate and non-graduate pay, and the graduate wage inequality has started to fall. We've seen a decoupling of degree requirements from job task content after 2006. Degree requirements rose in otherwise identical jobs as far as we can observe. There's some evidence for graduate skill task complementarities. Graduate skills become more productive as they're deployed to carry out high-skilled tasks. Task-warranted paper requirements, by contrast, hurt graduate pay. This model can capture some of the dynamic in graduate wage growth. And what's next for this project is to revisit some of these analyses using job vacancy data. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Golo. Excellent. I would like to encourage everyone to start sharing their questions and comments. Meanwhile, can I ask one clarification question? Sorry for my ignorance, maybe you explained, but I missed it. So what exactly do you mean by task-warranted paper requirement?
Well, we looked at the job task people did, people reported. We correlated that with the degree requirements, and then using those predictions and label them task-warranted degree requirements. So that's the part of the degree, that's part of the qualification requirements that are embedded in the task as far as we can say. And that component, turns out, is also the relevant component when it comes to pay. So it's not the paper that you need to show to get the job, is the kind of stuff you do on the job that seems to matter for pay. And from my reading of the data, it's the slow growth of the latter, of that task-warranted component, that is particularly behind the sluggish or actually drop and afterwards zero growth in graduate real wages since the Great Recession. There's just not much happening in terms of jobs.
Thank you, Golo. Thank you. Let's see if our participants have any questions or comments that you would like to share around the research presented by Golo or around this broader topic related to skills and labour markets in the UK context or elsewhere. So Golo, tell us, while we are expecting questions, tell us, where do you hope to take this further. So what are the questions you hope to look at in the next few months? So where is this going?
I would like to better understand the need for paper qualifications and the use of paper qualifications in the British labor market. It doesn't seem, from this, it doesn't seem that they matter a great deal. That's one thing. The second thing is to make a more consistent case for the role of jobs for graduate outcomes. I think relating to the discussion we had before the lunch break in the employability panel, that it's really critical to understand what happens in the labor market on the demand side for graduate wages. I think universities can fiddle around with curriculum on the margin, or change, I don't know, introduce an Excel course in their curriculum. But in the end, what really matters is, in my opinion, at least, the demand for those skills.
Absolutely. And when you look at qualifications and skills, are you looking primarily at the university level qualifications, or qualifications across the board, including GCSEs, A levels, vocational qualifications?
Yeah, for this one, I've looked specifically at university qualifications, first degree and higher, given the discussion around graduate jobs. There's, of course, a wider discourse around the need for paper qualification, what matters, because it is important in a way that if it's paper qualification has got if paper qualifications matter for pay and access to jobs, for example, has different consequences than if it's about knowledge, skills, and the kind of work experience people bring with, because what our data also shows here is that it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need, it's not necessarily higher education. What would be then indeed more about the skills the individual can bring here. So that's something I'd like to examine.
Thank you so much. I see questions are coming in. Can I invite Francis Abuso, please, to pose your question, perhaps introduce yourself first. Thank you. Francis, do we have Francis Abuso?
Just please read my
yes, I will read it for you. How relevant are state board exams today, especially for teaching profession?
What are state board exams?
Well, if we had Francis, they would explain. Let's wait.
I mean, in the UK, at least in the English context in schools, the government has decided to waive the teaching qualification requirement. So it's actually hard to say. It is been an interesting case to understand. It would be actually, yeah, it's actually an interesting case study to better understand what consequences that actually had for teaching on the ground, waiving those qualification requirements, the licensing requirements. But it's very much my thinking is very much related to that. Is, do paper qualifications act as a kind of license in that you need to have them to get access, or are they more a certificate of skills?
This is quite a big question, isn't it? Because in regulated professions across the world, normally qualifications are required to enter that profession, to practice that profession. And normally teaching is one of those areas, together with medical profession and legal profession, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be quite an interesting study to see, to compare the teaching practices, learning practices in the classrooms where non-qualified teachers teach with those where we have qualified teachers, because that could be quite a revolutionary study, I suppose.
I don't. There must be studies. There must be studies, because there was like programs in the States for a while that Teach Fast and so forth, that brought non-education, non-teaching graduates into schools. I think there are a few more questions.
Absolutely, we will get there right now. So we have a question from Anand Chen. If Anand wants to come in to us to share the comment.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to say I totally agree with Golo's opinion. And for example, in China nowadays, due to the expansion of higher education, just graduates they can't get jobs due to the congestion in the labor market. And then also university they're trying to pay attention to promote employability, because in the past they have kind of overlooked this job that they're required to do. And also even those graduates who has found a job in the labor market, they sometimes lack the skills that are really necessary for workplace. So I think it's really a important issue, like worth paying attention to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anand.
Absolutely. If Golo wants to say anything regarding this comment, or maybe you have plans to take a more comparative approach in future.
Yeah, that would be interesting as well. That would be really good. I think there will be great variation across country in terms of how paper versus skill matter, and how employers decide on who to recruit. What signals do they value? My feeling is that, for example, in the UK, when I came here, I was surprised by how detailed and how the recruitment process actually went as a foreigner. I wasn't used to that. In Germany, it's a lot more paper-based, listing your qualifications. So it would be interesting to see if there are regimes in what matters, and I can very well imagine those differences.
Absolutely. Also, one important issue to consider is how internationalized the labor market is generally in a country, I suppose. So British labor market, if you look at specific sectors where we have lots of international actors, international businesses operating, could also bring their own cultural assumptions in terms of what is valued and what they're looking for, including in relation to paper qualifications, potentially, yes. Thank you. So let's move on to Albina's question. We will have after this perhaps time to take one or two more questions or comments. Please share your questions or comments in the chat if you would like to engage with Golo's talk. I would like to invite Albina Torbaeva now, please. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, Golo and Maia. My name is Albina. I'm from Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and I have worked in development many years, and I recently graduated from UCL Institute of Education. So I loved my years there. I had the chance to reflect on the topic, Golo, you presented today, because in Kazakhstan, Central Asia, we don't talk about this much. And having looked at our policies, seeing what's happening in one of my studies, I saw that actually it's the same issue taking place. We don't have much data, to be honest, especially state, to show this, that diploma disease, as I wrote in comment, it is taking place in Kazakhstan, Central Asia, because state agenda and individuals' desire is that human capital theory based, like we need more degrees. Everyone, all my friends, they invest their money into degrees, but actually they can't find jobs. So I was curious, what's the problem? Is it higher education doesn't, bring in good knowledge, skills, or are there any jobs available? So what I see is that actually graduate unemployment is growing in Central Asia. And I found small data available that there is growth in number of people who have higher education degree and who are unemployed. But nobody talks about this here. So, and my comment was that actually we should look broader at this problem. It's not university's problem. It can be macroeconomic. Like there isn't any jobs in Kazakhstan, skilled jobs, which graduates can have, especially decent employment, not any employment. And secondly, that maybe it's time we should move on from looking at higher education degree as, narrow economic approach, like only to get job, to increase individual or Kazakhstan's economic competitiveness. which is in all state agendas everywhere, in policies. Maybe it's, you know, we should look broader, like it's not only universities' task, it's employers' task, lifelong learning, and university is something more with non-economic returns, like, you know, kind of increasing critical thinking for democracy, I don't know, creativity, for increasing my human capabilities, my agency. So I was curious what your thoughts on this comment, or do you also agree, or maybe think, and I also agree that some comparative study would be a great idea, I guess, to see how it echoes globally, what's happening with this diploma disease, you know, like, yeah, sorry if I took long.
Thank you, Albina. Thank you. Golo, if you want.
Yeah, I fully agree that it's necessary to look at what happens to graduates in a broader picture. I don't think it's in a broader taking a macro level view here. Of course, country there will be differences country from country, but what the charts for the graduate labor market I presented showed is that actually taking a bird's eye view, there are the same forces apply to graduates and non-graduates. There's not like a clear distinction that one group does this and another group does that, or one group fares particularly well versus the other group doesn't. So if there's definitely a case for considering higher education and a broader, I don't know, learning as a place of learning in a wider in its wider educational setting. And then consequently as well, what are actually the economic constraints for the whole, what are the macro level economic constraints and issues?
Thank you, Golo. We are running out of time now, but I would very much like to bring in Fenella to share their comments. A comment from another international context from South Africa, and we will perhaps finish this part of the session with this comment. Fenella, if you would like to come in.
Hi, thanks Maia, thanks Golo for your presentation. Yeah, no, it's not a question, it's merely a contextual statement. You know, we have very high unemployment in South Africa, and the employers are less concerned with, they demand this, they say they want skills, and they say that universities aren't meeting their needs by producing graduates with the critical skills that they need. But in fact, there are way too many graduates for the number of jobs. And so the value of the degree lies in the fact that it is a signal for employers. And there's so much demand for jobs that what it does for a graduate is, if possible, you know, for some of them, it gets them a job for which they are then overqualified, but it gives them positional advantage over school leavers who are unqualified, who would be competing for that level of job.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We will have to finish on this comment. Thank you very much to Golo and everyone who participated with their questions and comments. Now we move on to our second presentation. Our speakers will be Michael Shattuck and Aniko Horvath. Michael Shattuck is an honorary research fellow at the University of Oxford. Aniko Horvath is assistant professor in the Department of Organization Sciences at the VU Amsterdam in Netherlands, and she's a researcher at the Center for Global Higher Education. Aniko and Michael are co-investigators on CG Project 6, which is titled The Impact of Locality and Region on University Governance. Okay, I would like to invite them. I think Michael is speaking first, if that's correct.
That is correct.
That's great. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I am going to be the main speaker in the presentation, but I hope Aniko will help me to deal with all the questions. Let me start by just decoding the title of our talk. And the words I want to decode are levelling up. That's a very British set of policies. And certainly what we're talking about is very much reversing the economic inequality between regions. The government has produced a white paper on levelling up. Legislation is planned. Just to go back to the white paper for a moment, there is very little reference in that to what higher education can contribute to levelling up. We're going to be saying something about that, though I'm not sure how welcome what we say will be to the government. We've taken as it were, our data for research, 12 universities as case studies, and we selected from across the whole breadth of UK higher education. In other words, Russell Group, other pre-92 universities, post-92 universities, and post-92 universities. And these were drawn from England, Scotland, and Wales. We had 3 comparator European countries, Norway, Ireland, and Germany, and we've been greatly assisted by the fact that Ellen Hazelcorn, who chaired one of the sessions yesterday, and Jürgen Enders have done separate contributions which are included in our book about Ireland and Germany. We should make the second point that our plan is that we will publish a book through the Bloomsbury Press early in 2023, and that's to be called Universities and Regions: The Impact of Locality and Region on University Governance and Strategies. If we move on to the whole question of levelling up, we should start by saying that when we conceived of the research, we didn't think in terms specifically of levelling up. So what we're talking about today and the project that we have to be published has moved into areas which in a way are rather a surprise to us. Levelling up, well, we came across it first of all about regional inequality in a very extremely interesting article by Dr. McCann called Perceptions of Regional Inequality and the Geography of Discontent in a journal called Regional Studies. And what he said was that what Britain showed was a greater inequality between regions than there was anywhere else in Europe. And that statement has been backed up later on, both by an IPPR North publication and indeed by the Levelling Up white paper itself. There's a mass of data which supports these conclusions. There's been a great deal of research done on the topic of inequality between regions. We've just quoted 2 examples here, which are on the slide. The first comes from the UK Competitive Index. And what that tells us is that the top performing localities, unsurprisingly, the top 10 are in London and in 2 peripheral towns to London, and the lowest are in the southwest, or in the west, 4 in the West Midlands and 1 in the northwest. And more significant is the statistic that of 317 local authority districts, 260 have at least one of the 20% most deprived areas And this comes from the ministry's own English indices of deprivation. And 4 of these most deprived areas contain universities in our study. You might then ask, how do universities correlate with this degree of regional inequality? Well, I can only say only too well. 41% of publicly funded R&D is actually spent in the Golden Triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London. 63% of QR funding, that is research funding derived from the research assessment exercises, 63% goes to the 24 members of the Russell Group. 10% of the British universities receive 48% of the funding. And of the so-called teaching universities, 63 combined receive only 13%. Again, if you look at how this is distributed regionally, 63% of QR funding goes to universities in the south, 22.5% goes to universities in the north, and 13% to universities in the West Midlands. So in other words, universities correlate quite closely to the inequalities that you find in regions. Another significant area of differentiation is related to student choice of university and the region that they subsequently seek employment in. And we have a table here which was constructed from our 12 universities and with their help. And I would like to just draw your attention quickly to the following. The first is that if you take the first column, what you see is that of the Russell Group and other pre-92 universities, something like 24% of their intake only comes from the regions in which the universities of themselves are cited. If you then look for comparison at the post-92 universities and the post-92 universities, what you'll see is a rough average of 70% of their students are in fact local students. If you look at the second column, what you see is that of the Russell Group and pre-92 group, only a small percentage, probably around 30%, of the graduates of the university stay in the region. Whereas if you look at the post-92 and the post-92, then what you see is that something like 50 to 60% of their students stay in the region. And perhaps the sharpest comparison is if you compare University D, a pre-92 university, and University E, which is a post-92 university. There what you will see is that for University E, 71% of their students come from the locality and from the region. And 71%, of course, they may not be exactly the same students, 71% of the students actually seek and obtain employment in the locality that the university is cited in. Whereas with University D, 76% of their students actually come from outside the area. And similarly, only 24% of their graduates stay in the region. Now, you may explain this simply as the result of the kind of marketized system that the UK has. But actually, our evidence is slightly different, because what it appears is, and it may be partly a result of the pandemic, is that more and more students are actually wanting to go to local universities. But we found this a very interesting set of statistics. That, in other words, you've got one group of universities that are entirely taking their students nationwide, and another, and a significant other group of universities that are taking their students primarily from their local environment. Now, if you then look at graduate retention and what it means, and we need to go to the next slide, we came across a really interesting research project published called The Benefits of Learning by Tom Schuller and others. And what they had done, and this is after all nearly 20 years ago now, what they had done is look at what were the benefits of learning to a relatively large group of UK citizens. And what they found was that the benefits included social capital, ability to take part in civic engagement, ability to join in SME enterprises, and to contribute to public service. Now, it's absolutely clear to us that those universities which were depositing their graduates back into their communities are actually playing a very significant role in levelling up. And the white paper sees levelling up entirely as a question of investing in cities, with the central idea that if you build up cities, they are the critical element in the further development of the knowledge economy. And of course, it's in cities where the Russell Group universities and other pre-92 universities are mainly cited. Now, they have made significant contributions to levelling up through capital-intensive innovation hubs in city centres. But what we would argue is that you should be giving parity of esteem to what you might call neighbourhood universities, who are actually reinforcing economic and social networks in deprived areas. One further theme in our research was the question of the further education, higher education interface. We, or rather I and Steve Hunt, also at the Institute of Education at that time, did a large-scale survey of UK further education colleges. And what we found on a return rate of 45% was that 89% of the colleges had formal program partnerships with universities, and that more than 50% of universities were involved. Now we published this as a CGHE working paper in last year, but this has a very dramatic impact on the way that you might look at tertiary education. What we found was FE colleges reached much further into communities than universities were able to. We also found evidence of where universities had set up networks, so that at one university there were 12 colleges contributing something like 30% of that university's intake and returning those local students back to a deprived community. Similarly, in Scotland, the Highlands and Islands University, 95% of students from the 13 colleges and research establishments that make up the University of the Highlands and Islands, 95% went back into their communities. That drove us to the conclusion that what in England we badly need is a tertiary education system, which brings decision-making on colleges and universities together and not separately as at present. And this could only be achieved if you decentralize the whole system to regions. So what we found ourselves with is a series of policy findings. The first is that we wanted to restructure further and higher education into a tertiary education system. And as Peter Scott mentioned in his talk, Wales has already gone in that direction and Scotland is anticipating in doing so. Secondly, we want to recognize the success of decentralization and devolution of higher education to Scotland and Wales as being also applicable in England. Peter made a reference to the success in Scotland. We can say, and we researched this in our previous book on British governance of higher education. We found that the Scottish and the Welsh higher education systems actually remained internationally competitive and distinctive. The devolution had been successful. The white paper argues that central governance should be devolved more to regions. We argue that we should use the Metro Mayor combined authorities structure, which is being created, to be the vehicles for decentralization. After all, Greater Manchester has got about the same population size as Wales. There is no reason why these regions cannot take over and run the governance of higher education in their areas. To protect institutional autonomy, we would require each region to establish a policy and governance committee, but for a tertiary education system. What this would do is it would reverse the trend to centralization begun in 1919 with the creation of the University Grants Committee. It's completely within the spirit of the white paper. We think it would increase diversity, it would make the system more pluralistic, it would widen participation by moving higher education much closer to deprived areas. It would encourage a bottom-up policy-making environment rather than the bureaucratic top-down system that we have at the moment. And above all, it would contribute to breaking the grip of central government control over higher education. We think this will be a useful agenda for the government to adopt, though we're not optimistic that it will do so immediately. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I see questions are coming in. this is a very interesting proposal. I'm listening, very interesting policy recommendations, listening to it the second time. I remember you presented this also a few days ago here at Oxford, and I have been thinking about this. I want to ask a slightly provocative question, if I may. Obviously, this makes a lot of sense what you are proposing, decentralizing FE and HE to regions and restructuring FE and HE to a tertiary education system. So if the decentralization is successful and there are indeed combined authorities that are in charge of higher education within regions, what do you think might be potential problems with this approach? I wondered. Do you see any potential problems that may arise in if higher education becomes part of basically local authorities or local combined authorities or mayor's offices, etc.?
Well, if Annika will forgive me, I've got two quick answers to that very large question. The first part of my answer would be that, of course, some elements of the running of higher education would have to remain centrally. In other words, we currently look after research and the funding of research and so forth centrally. I would anticipate that that would stay central. Secondly, there would have to be some sort of regulator to make sure that a degree stayed a degree across the whole system. So that would deal with one part of the problem. Now, another, if I go back to 1992, there were serious worries within the academic community that devolving higher education to Scotland and Wales would encourage parochialism and narrow-mindedness and too much of a concentration on regional interests. But that, I can say, has not been the case. And I made the point in my talk that these universities stay internationally competitive. They have probably become more distinctive, but it works. It will frighten English universities to think that they get their governance is passed to a West Midlands authority, for example. But actually, long term, it would be likely to provide a much more interesting, pluralistic higher education system.
Thank you.
May I add just something to that?
Please,
that one other issue that is always a concern, it's about institutional autonomy and being closer to the governance system. It might mean more impact, but comparative studies, for example, in Norway, where there is a very strong connection to the national and the regional governments, and there is a strong interaction there, it shows that it doesn't happen, it doesn't have to happen that way. Actually, the closeness, it's improving the way people can make decisions within an institution. It gives them an advantage over a more centralized and more dependent kind of governance structure. So it wouldn't necessarily mean, of course, it can go wrong, and there should be certain protections in the system, but it doesn't absolutely mean. And there is international trends where you can actually check for that and have good examples of how it can be done. And Wales, for example, and Scotland actually prove that it's working that way, that you are closer to your government, but that doesn't mean that you are actually disadvantaged by that. It brings more advantages than disadvantages.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Can I invite Michael Radcliffe, please, to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. So I wondered what your view was on what the government's just legislated for in England, which is our part of the skills bill, which is the local skills improvement plans. There was quite a lot of concern in the House of Lords that these could become very parochial. And there was a fine example of how the LSIP for East Sussex might become very much all based on hospitality and health and social care, and not actually interested in wider skills, and therefore all you'd get in that bit of the country is very parochial stuff, and you wouldn't get anything else. I just wondered how you thought that kind of thing was going to work with autonomy, where actually you would need that broader thing, particularly as some of the boundaries that we will end up drawing on these things will be pretty arbitrary between local authorities, and therefore you end up with all sorts of weird things, whereby you'll have more concentration of some types of HEIs with a particular patch. There isn't going to be a national plan for how many aeronautic universities we have. So how that kind of thing work? Are we just going to sacrifice a lot of autonomy to discover we're all going to be doing health and social care courses?
Well, Aniko, maybe I should have a first crack at that. I think one of the interesting things that has happened just in this in 2022 is that there's been a review within the department of the governance of further education. And in spite of the fact that the white paper on levelling up talks about devolving initiative to regions, etc., the conclusion of the review and the conclusion of the department is that further education governance needs to be further centralized, and a committee is being set up with industry and so forth to actually increase the centralization of policy in terms of further education. What we think is that if regions became responsible, you might have a much more liberal view of where you would put colleges, which colleges you would support, etc., and particularly you wouldn't drive them necessarily entirely on budget if they were actually being really successful in widening participation in deprived areas. So I would say that you would get a much broader view of further education if it was handled at regional level than you ever will if it's only handled at national level. Aniko, I don't know whether anything you...
Just two very quick points. One of them is that having that kind of implicit assumptions that at the regional level cannot be seen, these things cannot be seen at a more global or more national perspective, has some kind of inherent, sometimes some kind of inherent view that well, it's a hierarchy that the elites in the center are thinking more global, and at the local level or the regional level, you are not capable of judging that or having a strategy that would actually be a much broader one than just looking to healthcare and other things. And some of the data that we collected actually shows that universities in cooperation already with local authorities can have a very broad offering, and they can actually have a very global view because it is in the interest of the universities. That was what brings them the research money. And the research exercise actually shows that many of the so-called teaching-oriented universities are actually having really, really strong global pockets and international pockets of research. And the way they do it, and we asked questions about that, and the way they do it actually is by trying to understand the local context and scale it up to a global level. So I do think that's kind of a narrow view and understanding of what's happening between universities in regions at that level. The other question, the second part of the question, that how do you decide about regions? I guess that's really, it's a practical but also a more difficult question maybe, and it needs to be looked at probably between universities, regions, national level, but I don't think that is something that it cannot be done.
Can I just add to that, to the first part of Aniko's response? We came across a classic case of where college and university and community can work together. This was in South Wales under the University of South Wales. University of South Wales actually has, as part of the university, a FE College in Merthyr Tydfil, one of the most deprived areas in the country. That college recruits students from the Welsh valleys, previously Welsh coal mining communities, and very inward looking. They started a degree in health sciences, health science administration. People came from the valleys to the very short distance to Merthyr Tydfil to the college. It became clear that you could build on that first 2 years to create a degree in nursing. But the students were not prepared to go the 10 miles to Pontypridd, where the headquarters of the university were. This was outside their region, as it were. The university decided that it would then move its nursing teaching down to Merthyr Tydfil. What we've now got is students coming from the valleys to Merthyr Tydfil College, getting a nursing degree and instantly being recruited by the large hospital complex just outside Merthyr Tydfil. In other words, it's an absolutely virtual circle of widening participation, transforming the community, and so forth. And that, I think, is the answer to the question about would further education be narrowed by our proposals? On the contrary, I think it would be widened.
Thank you very much. I see a few other questions coming in. Unfortunately, we have now reached the end of the session. There were questions just to give an idea to participants, a question on the role of the Open University in the leveling up agenda. And there are also 2 questions, one related to the indeterminacy of English regions and the role of indeterminacy in devolving, in the potential devolving of higher education, and second on the on where do students come from? Are the students coming from local, regional, or national contexts? I'm afraid we have no more time to address these questions, but I hope we will have other opportunities of discussing these very interesting proposals. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our excellent speakers. We will now have to end this session, and I look forward to seeing you in one of the parallel sessions, which will start at 3:10, so which will start in 10 minutes time. Thank you again and see you soon.
Thank you, Maia.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.